I don't know. But I'll tell you something, Doc. You better not mess around with Nades there.
Ken Curtis will always be remembered as Festus Hagen from Gunsmoke, that scruffy, lovable deputy with the scratchy voice and crooked grin who made millions of Americans laugh and feel at home every week. But while the character seemed simple and carefree, the man playing him carried a much more complicated story. Behind the warmth and humor was a person who dealt with real frustrations, hidden tensions, and personal heartbreaks that he rarely talked about publicly. Only near the end of his life did he open up about 5 people in Hollywood he had quietly resented for years, people whose actions or presence had left a lasting mark on him. To understand why, you first have to understand who Ken Curtis really was, where he came from, and what kind of journey brought him to one of the most beloved roles in the history of American television. If you enjoy stories like this, the real lives behind Hollywood's biggest names, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. Now let's get into it. Ken Curtis was born Curtis Wayne Gates on July 2, 1916, in a small town called Lamar, Colorado. His childhood was anything but ordinary. While most kids his age were growing up in regular homes with backyards and neighborhood friends, Ken spent his early years living inside a jailhouse. His father, Dan Gates, worked as the sheriff of Bent County, and the family lived in a small apartment right above the jail itself. The sounds of iron bars, heavy doors, and echoing footsteps were as normal to Ken as birdsong might be to other children. His mother, Nellie, cooked meals not just for the family, but also for the prisoners being held below. Ken would often watch her pass food through the bars, giving him a very different view of the world from a very young age. It was a strange and unusual upbringing, but it shaped him in ways that would show up throughout his life, giving him a natural understanding of hardship, dignity, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from growing up around people who have hit rock bottom. Despite the unusual setting, Ken showed early signs of a creative spirit, particularly in music. He had a natural ear for it and felt drawn to singing in a way that nothing else matched. But when the Great Depression hit and the country fell into economic despair, practical thinking took over in many households, including his. His parents encouraged him to aim for something more stable and secure, so Ken enrolled at Colorado College with the goal of becoming a doctor. He gave it a real try, spending about 2 years working toward that path, but the pull of music never went away. If anything, it got stronger the longer he stayed in school. Medicine offered safety, but it didn't speak to his soul. After 2 years, he made a decision that surprised many people around him. He walked away from medical school and chose to chase a life in music instead. It was a bold move, especially at a time when the world was still struggling through the Depression and World War II was beginning to cast its shadow across the horizon. There were no guarantees, no safety net, just a young man with a voice and a dream. That leap of faith began paying off sooner than many expected. In the early 1940s, Ken was invited to join the band of Tommy Dorsey as a vocalist. This was no small opportunity. Dorsey was already a legend in the American music scene, leading one of the most popular orchestras in the country. Stepping in as a singer meant stepping into shoes that had recently been worn by Frank Sinatra himself, which came with enormous expectations. But Ken had a smooth, warm voice and a natural charisma that audiences responded to quickly. It was also during this time that he made one of the most important decisions of his career. Following advice from Dorsey, he dropped his birth name, Curtis Wayne Gates, and adopted the stage name Ken Curtis. It was cleaner, sharper, and better suited to the entertainment world he was entering. From that point on, the name stuck, and so did his rising reputation. After finding his footing in the big band world, Ken discovered an even better fit for his particular sound, Western music. He became the lead singer of the Sons of the Pioneers, a legendary group with a devoted following and a catalog of beloved radio hits. With his warm and sincere voice, he helped bring songs like Room Full of Roses and Ghost Riders in the Sky to life, tracks that became deeply connected to the golden age of Western music. Many fans of that era remember him first as a singer rather than an actor, which speaks to how seriously he took his musical career. Around the same time, he also hosted a radio program called Chuck Wagon Jamboree, a 15-minute syndicated show produced in Los Angeles that ran for about 2 years and roughly 131 episodes. Each broadcast mixed Western ballads with light-hearted comedy and always ended with a hymn, creating a warm and memorable experience for listeners. Looking back, the format of that show, storytelling, humor, and music blended together, quietly hinted at the kind of performer Ken would become on screen. But even with all that musical success, Ken wanted something more. His natural charm and easy confidence opened the door to Hollywood, and by the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, he began making the transition into acting. He started with Western-themed musicals and smaller cowboy films, learning the craft steadily and building a foundation that would eventually support something much bigger. He also began working alongside some of the most respected names in Hollywood, appearing in films directed by the legendary John Ford and sharing the screen with icons like John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. These weren't throwaway roles. Ken held his own even in that kind of company, and his performances showed a genuine talent for bringing authenticity to frontier characters. He wasn't chasing glamour or big paydays. He was drawn to roles with grit, honesty, and a sense of real human feeling. Still, all of those years and all of those roles would eventually be overshadowed by the one that defined him for millions of people, Festus Hagen. In 1964, Ken joined Gunsmoke at a critical moment. Dennis Weaver, who had played the original deputy Chester Good, had just left the show to pursue other opportunities, and the producers needed someone who could bring fresh energy without losing the loyal audience the show had built. Ken turned out to be exactly the right person at exactly the right time. What was supposed to be a one-time guest appearance quickly turned into something permanent. Viewers fell in love with Festus almost immediately. The scratchy voice, the offbeat humor, the homespun wisdom mixed with occasional foolishness, it all came together in a way that felt completely natural. Festus was tough without being cold, funny without being ridiculous, and loyal without ever feeling fake. Over the course of more than a decade and over 300 episodes, he became one of the most beloved characters in the history of American television. Ken brought the same dedication to that role that he had brought to everything else in his career. He never treated a scene carelessly, never mailed in a performance, and never let the repetition of a long-running show make him lazy. Even when scripts became familiar and the shooting schedule became exhausting, he gave every scene his full attention. He often spoke with genuine pride about being part of Gunsmoke, understanding that the show had become a meaningful part of family life across America during one of television's most important eras. But behind all of that success and dedication, there were tensions that most fans never saw. Before his death, Ken revealed the names of 5 people he had genuinely disliked during his time in Hollywood, and the first name on that list was James Arness, the towering star who played Marshal Matt Dillon for the entire run of Gunsmoke. Arness wasn't just the lead of the show, he was the show. His presence dominated nearly every scene, and audiences worshipped him. For the other actors working alongside, living in that enormous shadow wasn't always easy. Ken made Festus into a fan favorite in his own right, but no matter how beloved that character became, he was still the deputy, always second to Arness's Marshal. Over time, stories began to surface suggesting that Ken had quietly hoped Festus would eventually receive the same kind of recognition and central focus that Matt Dillon enjoyed. That shift never really came, and whether the frustration was as deep as some claimed or simply exaggerated over the years, the tension between the two men was something people on set could sense, even if it never boiled over publicly. Next on Ken's list was Milburn Stone, the veteran actor who played the sharp and gruff Doc Adams. Stone had been with the show from the very beginning and carried a natural authority that came with being one of its founding cast members. When Ken joined years later, he was stepping into a cast that had already found its groove and its pecking order. Reports from the time suggest that Ken and Stone clashed more than once, particularly over issues like screen time and creative direction. Both men had strong personalities, and strong personalities often find ways to conflict. Even so, their professionalism kept things together on screen, where their interactions always felt real and compelling, perhaps made even more interesting by the tension that existed when the cameras weren't rolling. Then there was John Mantley, the show's longtime producer, and this is where the conflict felt most grounded in reality rather than rumor. Mantley ran a tight operation, strict with budgets, demanding with scripts, and not particularly open to actors pushing for more influence over their roles. As Festus grew into one of the show's most popular characters, Ken naturally began to feel he deserved more. More screen time, more story focus, more fair compensation for the value he was bringing to the show. Reports suggest the two men argued more than once, with Ken pushing for Festus to take on a bigger role in Dodge City while Mantley resisted any shift in that direction. Unlike some of the other rumored feuds, this one had a harder edge to it, something that people on set reportedly noticed without much difficulty. Amanda Blake, who played the beloved Miss Kitty, also made the list. She had been one of the show's brightest and most enduring stars, loved by audiences for her strength and warmth. But as Festus's popularity continued to grow over the years, quiet whispers suggested that Blake wasn't entirely comfortable watching the spotlight shift in Ken's direction. Some believed she felt that his rising prominence gradually pulled attention away from her well-established role. Whether that perception was accurate or simply the product of tabloid gossip, it added another complicated layer to the behind-the-scenes story of the show. What remains undeniable, however, is that whenever Blake and Curtis shared the screen, they were wonderful together. Whatever may have existed off-camera stayed there, which speaks volumes about both of them as professionals. The fifth name was Dennis Weaver, the actor whose departure had created the opening for Ken in the first place. Weaver had made Chester Good into an icon, the shuffling, good-natured deputy with a distinctive limp and down-home charm that audiences adored. When he left, the question on everyone's mind was whether anyone could truly fill that space. That question followed Ken from the moment he stepped onto the set, and comparisons between Chester and Festus were unavoidable for years. Some who knew Ken suggested he carried that weight more heavily than he ever let on, quietly aware that Weaver's shadow lingered even as Festus carved out his own identity. Over time, Festus absolutely became his own character, with his own devoted following. But getting there meant enduring years of being measured against someone else, and that kind of pressure doesn't just vanish overnight. Away from the professional world, Ken's personal life told its own complicated story. He had 2 marriages before finding lasting happiness. The first, to Lorraine Page in 1943, ended quietly, without children, likely the victim of 2 young careers pulling in different directions. The second, to Barbara Ford in 1952, was more high-profile. Barbara was the daughter of director John Ford, the very man Ken had been working with on a series of successful Western films. The marriage brought prestige, but also unspoken pressure. It lasted more than a decade before ending in 1964, in the same quiet year Ken joined Gunsmoke. No scandal, no public drama, just 2 people who had grown apart. 2 years after that divorce, everything changed when he met Toria Hearn Connolly. She had no connection to Hollywood and no interest in fame, which was likely a large part of her appeal. She was warm, grounded, and genuine, someone who saw Ken as a person rather than a public figure. Their relationship grew slowly and naturally, built not on red carpets and industry events, but on road trips, quiet dinners, and laughter shared in private. Ken stepped into the role of father figure for Toria's 2 children from a previous marriage and embraced it fully, giving them his time and care with the same sincerity he brought to everything else. He often described his life with Toria as one of his greatest blessings, and those who knew them said she softened him in ways that were visible to everyone around them. After Gunsmoke finally ended, Ken and Toria chose a genuinely quiet life. Fishing trips, long drives through the countryside, visits to small Western festivals where fans still recognized him, but where recognition no longer defined his days. He took on smaller roles here and there, including a part in the short-lived NBC drama The Yellow Rose, and a final film appearance in 1991 alongside Sam Elliott and Catherine Ross in a television movie based on a Louis L'Amour story. Playing an aging stagecoach driver, he brought the same quiet authenticity that had always been his signature. There was no reinvention, no attempt to chase relevance, just a man doing what he had always done, with honesty and care. One notable moment from those later years came in 1987 when CBS announced the Gunsmoke reunion film, Return to Dodge. Fans immediately expected Festus to be there, but when the film aired, Ken was absent. He had been invited, but negotiations had broken down over salary. After more than a decade of giving that character everything he had, he was offered compensation he found genuinely insulting, and he walked away on principle. He never made a public fuss about it. He simply didn't go and let the silence explain itself. On April 28, 1991, Ken Curtis passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74 following a heart attack at home in Clovis, California, with Toria beside him. Honoring his wishes, his ashes were scattered across the open lands of Colorado, near where his story had first begun. It was exactly the kind of farewell that suited him. No grand ceremony, no Hollywood spectacle, just a man returning to the land that had shaped him, steady and rooted to the very end.